panel. And the Northern Ireland conflict, that's Brian Dooley and María José Guembe, who are both members of the panel. And then we have two comparative speakers, Maurice Politi from Brazil and Brigitte Sylvain, who will speak to the Lebanon situation. We're going to do this as a dialogue with the speakers. First of all, and just to give you some background regarding the Northern Ireland conflict and impunity. So, as some people will know, there was an armed conflict in Northern Ireland from the late 1960s until the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The three sets of protagonists in the conflict, which were two sets of non-state actors, firstly Irish Republican armed groups, secondly British Loyalist paramilitary groups, and then also state actors, primarily the British Army and the militarized police force. Officially, in the legal sense, this was not a war. The ordinary law applied rather than international humanitarian law. And it's always important to emphasize that all sides committed serious violations, killings, and torture during the conflict. What you can't say, and our focus is impunity, what you can't say is there was absolute impunity for, say, the non-state actors who were Irish Republican armed groups. Tens of thousands of people went to prison. Thousands of British Loyalist paramilitaries also went to prison. But it's a very different situation with state actors where only 4 soldiers from the regular army went to prison for short periods of time. There's 3 principal patterns of human rights violations that are looked at within the Bitter Legacy report. The first is state killings, where there were very limited, if any, investigations. The second pattern of violations was the use of torture, particularly in custody, and torture that was exported, specific techniques of torture known at the time as the 5 techniques, although we know there were now at least 7, but there is evidence that they were exported by the British military to other places, including Brazil at the time. And then the final pattern of human rights violations was the issue of collusion or connivencia, as it's known in Colombia and other places, whereby state actors collaborated with loyalist paramilitary groups. I see the report has been put up in the link on the Norwegian website. There are copies of the report, also, or the summary of the report in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. Just to give some background about the Northern Ireland situation, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 did not have a transitional justice mechanism, a truth commission, or anything else. And in our contention, the ordinary justice system at the time did not have the capacity to effectively investigate the state. Therefore, given there was no transitional justice mechanism, CAJ, other families and NGOs took a series of cases to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that the right to life had been violated as there was no capacity to investigate past violations, either directly by the state or with paramilitary collusion. In the group of cases known as the McCurr cases, the European Court of Human Rights found in our favour, found there had been procedural violations of Article 2, and as a result, the British government was forced to introduce a whole series of reforms within the ordinary justice system. This was known as the package of measures, and this meant that the justice system was changed in order that it could investigate past violations. There were also negotiations over many years for specific transitional justice institutions to be established, and an agreement was reached in 2014 between the British and Irish governments on new transitional justice mechanisms, but the British government delayed its implementation. If you move to the year 2020, by then, the package of measures within the ordinary justice system had actually started to deliver for families in the sense of truth recovery and historical clarification. You can see that in the context that the peace process had led to significant judicial and institutional reform, as well as the incorporation of the European Convention of Human Rights within Northern Ireland law. And whilst that has not led to a single day in prison for state actors, what has happened through civil cases and inquests and investigative reports in the last 10 years was historical clarification and truth recovery. And although that may have only limited past impunity slightly, it certainly seems to have challenged significantly the official truth of the conflict, whereby the British government had claimed that the vast majority of state killings were lawful, had denied torture, and had denied patterns of collusion. And even this limited results from the package of measures seemed to prove too much for the populist British government of Boris Johnson in 2020. So his government unilaterally reneged on the 2014 agreement for transitional justice institutions and instead passed legislation through the UK Parliament that we'll call the 2023 Legacy Act. This was expressly passed through the UK Parliament to protect the military from the justice system. It's been heavily criticised by the UN mechanisms, by the Council of Europe mechanisms, and remains the subject of an interstate case before the European Court of Human Rights, taken by the Irish government. The 2023 Legacy Act essentially does three things. One is it completely closes down the ordinary justice system's ability to investigate conflict-related violations, essentially abolishes the package of measures, bans the courts, even in civil cases, bans fact-finding hearings, bans police investigations, bans police ombudsman investigations, and other proceedings that would investigate conflict-related cases. And instead, the legislation sets up a government-appointed legacy commission as the only body with competence for historic investigations, but with very limited functions, with very limited practical independence. A former police commander is in fact the commissioner for investigations, and the control of the reports from the commission, in particular insofar as they relate to violations by agents of the state, are controlled by ministers who can redact reports before they reach families. The courts have already found that this process is not compatible with the European Convention of Human Rights in certain aspects. There is ongoing litigation. The 2023 Act also contained an amnesty scheme, but that has been found to be unlawful, ECHR incompatible, and not applied. Last year, there was a change of British government, with a Labour government coming in with a manifesto commitment to repeal the 2023 Legacy Act, but 1 year on, they have not done so. So that's the background context of the Northern Ireland situation. What I'm going to do now is turn to the first of our guests, Brian Dooley, who is here with me. He is, as well as a member of the International Panel on State Impunity in the Northern Ireland conflict. He is a senior advisor at Human Rights First, Washington, D.C. based human rights NGO, where he has worked on a range of international contexts, including currently in Ukraine, but also in Bahrain, Poland, Hong Kong, Egypt, and other places. He previously also worked for Amnesty International. So Brian, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you.
My first question is about the panel itself. The Impunity Panel, which was convened by the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights at the University of Oslo at the request of human rights groups in Northern Ireland, ourselves and another group the Pat Finucane Centre. You were tasked to produce an independent report about the extent of impunity during the Northern Ireland conflict. Can you tell us about that process and the methodology you used?
Yes, thank you, Daniel, and thank you everybody else who's come to listen to us today. I'm going to talk a bit about how the panel worked, things which I think worked well, and things which, were we to do it again, maybe we would have done differently. But the panel was organised by the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights, and they got half a dozen of us with different areas of expertise from different countries around the world. They needed somebody with an expertise, for instance, specifically around torture, another on collusion between British state actors and paramilitaries, and also, and you're going to hear in a while from my colleague on the panel, María José, an expert on the voices and the contribution in the process or not in terms of state mechanisms of survivors and victims of bereaved families. So as Daniel said, we decided to look at three areas: killings by British soldiers, mostly, torture and abuse also by British security forces, soldiers and police, and then this other slightly more complicated area of collusion, and whether or not there was impunity for paramilitaries if they also happened to be informers or agents of the British state. What we were not doing was trying to write a history of the conflict. We were not even trying to write a history of British state abuses during the conflict. We were trying to keep it narrow on an assessment of the extent of impunity for British security forces when there was some evidence that they had committed a crime. There was a fourth area we decided not to pursue because we already had a fairly big task just in those three, which was we didn't look at the area of people who'd been shot by British soldiers but who survived, and so that would have been hundreds more people. We already had hundreds of cases of people who'd been shot by British soldiers to study. And so we divided up the areas according to our expertise, 2 to 3 people working on each, but with the expertise brought by María José, which she's going to talk about, that strand of what about listening to, what about the needs of the victims and survivors, cut across all of those. We were backed by a huge amount of research expertise, dozens, I would say, of postgrad students, either which we managed to get through the various NGOs that we worked for on the panel. 1 or 2 of us were academics too and managed to bring some of that. Queen's University Belfast also supplied some great research expertise. So it was a big project and a big team. It took us about 2 years. One of the things which we hadn't really figured out at the start was when it should end. And so we launched into this full of enthusiasm, quite rightly so. There was a huge amount of documentation to go through. We relied on a few sources. One was recently declassified documents from the British state, and we're guessing at least 500,000 pages of those to be sorted through. Also testimony from survivors and witnesses. But there was a lot of work to do. It took us 2 years, and by the end of it, we're trying to figure out, should we carry on? Because the more we unearthed, the more questions arose, and you could see more lines of research which were asking to be followed, right? But some practicalities came in there too. You know, some of us were doing this on behalf of the NGO or institution we were working for. Others were doing it voluntarily. All of us, to some extent, we're doing it partly voluntarily. So by the the start of 2024, we decided we would have a deadline of May the 1st of last year, which was when new legislation was going to come in, brought in by the British government.
The 2023 Legacy Act.
The 2023 Legacy Act came into force the 1st of May 24. So we decided, okay, we've certainly got more than enough now to make an assessment.
So, I mean, at that time, then you'd produced essentially what you could call an unofficial Truth Commission report, but in the absence of an official mechanism, with a focus on impunity. The context of this was the 2023 Legacy Act that the then British government had tried to justify by stating that the justice system was disproportionately and unfairly persecuting soldiers. But your report reached a very different conclusion. Your report reached the conclusion that pointed to there, in fact, having been widespread and systemic impunity for state-involved human rights violations during the Northern Ireland conflict. Mm-hmm. Could you give us a bit of a flavour as to what mechanisms, sort of legal, political, institutional, that in the view of the panel had enabled this impunity that you'd found to persist for so long?
Well, this was one of, I think, the most thoughtful conversations that we had in the panel. We'd accrued all of this evidence, and then we had to decide, what did this mean? Were we going to say, look, there are patterns here, and it shows that there would it's not just a few bad apples who are soldiers or a few bad apples who are police officers. So we decided it was much more than that. But then how do you describe it? If it's not that, what is it? And so we looked at each of those categories, the killings, the torture, and the collusion, and decided in each of those categories, the impunity had been widespread, systematic, and systemic. And we found that the impunity sort of fed on itself, right? That if perpetrators were not brought to account, then more crimes were likely to be committed. Partly because people thought, well, I'm immune here. I'm going to get away with it, or so and so got away with it, and therefore, if I commit this crime, I'm likely not to be held to account. And in a very direct way too. I mean, you see people who were multiple offenders, the same people across many years, who were allowed to carry on committing crimes because they had not been brought to account for the first or second crime they committed. I mean, at root of this, really what happened was that so-called security concerns trumped justice and accountability. We found that there were occasions when police officers were trying to do a professional job. They were trying to investigate either other police officers or informers within paramilitary groups. And those investigations that they were trying to carry out were shut down or quietly put to the side. So there was absolutely a systemic push for impunity for a whole range of these crimes.
Thanks, Brian. I'll bring in María José now, the second member of the panel. So María José is a member of the panel. She is a human rights lawyer by trade with a degree in international human rights law. She's currently the president of the FIDH member group in Argentina, CELS, and a specialist in transitional justice. We will do this section in Spanish. María José, bienvenida.
Hola, ¿me escuchan bien? Yo no veo mi cámara. ¿Tengo la cámara encendida?
No tienes la cámara encendida, no.
Sabes que lamento que no pude ingresar antes como habíamos quedado y no logro encender la cámara.
Okay,
¿Puedo?
te podemos oír bien por lo
Bueno,
menos.
bueno, me disculpo por eso entonces.
Ok, mire, vamos a hacer el contraste de Argentina e Irlanda del Norte. Si han citado Argentina como ejemplo mundial de la justicia transicional, sobre todo por los juicios que han tenido lugar y por las condenas a militares y militares de alto rango, hay un contraste obvio con Irlanda del Norte, cuando después del acuerdo Viernes Santo ningún actor estatal ha pasado un día en la cárcel, a pesar de las las evidencias que han salido de patrones de violaciones de derechos humanos. Como integrante del panel de experto de impunidad en el London Norte, investigaste el impacto en las víctimas de la impunidad para los actores estatales. Cuéntanos un poco de esto y también cómo ves el contraste entre las dos situaciones, la situación en Argentina y la situación en el London Norte. Si nos puedes explicar también los principales motivos para el éxito relativo en Argentina en los últimos años sobre la justicia transicional y también si se podía replicar en otros sitios. María José, ¿todavía nos puedes oír?
Sí, ahí
Y creo que
algo
la cámara
cambió.
puede funcionar ahora también, María José, si lo puedes intentar.
Ah, sí, a
Ahora,
ver,
ahora sí te podemos ver.
ahora sí. Bueno. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos y todas quienes nos acompañan y en especial a los organizadores. Gracias Daniel y Brian. Muy interesante la pregunta que haces. La verdad es que tenemos unas situaciones bastante diferentes en Irlanda del Norte y en Argentina. Desde mi experiencia en Argentina, la mirada que yo tengo sobre lo ocurrido en Irlanda del Norte es que el contexto en sí ha sido bastante distinto, sobre todo por el tipo de conflicto, por tratarse, como advierte siempre Paul O'Connor de Pat Finucane Center, de una situación entre una sociedad que busca justicia y unos responsables de las violaciones a los derechos humanos que no forman parte de esa misma sociedad, sino que están ubicados geográficamente fuera del país. Esto ha marcado una diferencia bastante grande porque la presión social ejerce muchísimo, ejerce un rol mucho menor que el que, por ejemplo, ejerce en mi propio país, donde la sociedad ha sido uno de los factores principales en que se pudiera avanzar en la búsqueda de verdad, justicia y reparación. Los familiares en Irlanda del Norte, en las entrevistas que pudimos llevar a cabo, que fueron muchas y que transcurrieron en las ciudades de Derry, en Belfast, en Armagh y en Dublin también, tanto con víctimas de torturas, sobrevivientes, como con familiares de personas que fueron víctimas de asesinatos. Lo que remarcan es que las investigaciones que han habido, que han sido pocas, sobre todo han sido ineficientes y no han cumplido con ningún estándar internacional. Los familiares identifican claramente la falta de habilitación para que pudiesen participar y promover las investigaciones, la falta de información a las propias familias respecto de lo ocurrido, las deficiencias durante el desarrollo de las investigaciones, donde las pruebas no fueron protegidas, donde tampoco se protegió la escena del crimen. Durante el conflicto, ellos denuncian que las investigaciones no tuvieron ninguna seriedad y que de hecho fueron conducidas por las propias fuerzas a la que pertenecía la persona acusada, de modo que no hubo independencia ni tampoco hubo imparcialidad en esas investigaciones. También otra cuestión que destacan es el anonimato que se garantiza a quienes son los acusados como responsables de los crímenes, a quienes durante las investigaciones se los identifica con alguna letra del alfabeto y no con su nombre real. Estos nombres son supuestamente resguardados para que no puedan cruzarse la letra con la que se lo identifica con el nombre real. Y en muchas ocasiones lo que denuncian los familiares es que al momento de, terminado el conflicto, cuando se volvió a llevar adelante una investigación sobre los casos, las listas donde estaban asociados nombres y letras habían desaparecido y entonces ya nunca pudieron llevarse a cabo investigaciones respecto de esas personas que sí se habían empezado durante el conflicto, pero que no habían cumplido con ningún estándar de eficacia o de seriedad. Entonces también esta cuestión del anonimato, de acuerdo a la perspectiva de los familiares de las víctimas, lo que trae aparejado es la imposibilidad de cruzar casos y de identificar si una persona ha participado en más de un evento, de modo de poder establecer patrones o establecer algún marco de generalidad o rasgos de generalidad de las violaciones a los derechos humanos, algo que en tratándose de violaciones masivas es muy importante poder establecer. Hay cuestiones que desde mi propia perspectiva me han llamado la atención. La sociedad argentina es una sociedad, la sociedad civil, que permanentemente reclama juicio y castigo. En las investigaciones que pude, en las que participé, en las entrevistas con los familiares en Irlanda, me llamó la atención que lo que más demandaban era la responsabilización. Más de una vez me han dicho, lo que nosotros queremos no es necesariamente la prisión, quizás ni siquiera tenemos expectativa de que la prisión se concrete, pero lo que sí queremos es que alguien diga que esto ocurrió, que lo que hicimos fue ilegal, que reconozcan el daño y que pidan perdón. O sea, como que el reconocimiento de responsabilidad y el pedido de disculpas está en un nivel de valoración muy alto por parte de los familiares. Y yo relaciono esto con que no hay ninguna posibilidad de hacer justicia o de brindar reparaciones si previamente no hay reconocimiento de responsabilidad por parte del Estado, por parte de los responsables. Esto es algo que aparece muy claramente en los contactos con las familias y con los sobrevivientes. Por
Ok.
otro lado, sí,
Luego de hablar un poco más despacio por los intérpretes.
ay, sí, perdón. Por otra parte, se refieren también los familiares a las deficiencias no solamente de las investigaciones, sino de las pocas reparaciones económicas que ha habido. Lo que se pudo investigar y establecer desde el panel fue que en muchos casos, frente a la posibilidad de que una demanda de daños y perjuicios diera lugar a un juicio civil en el que se produjeran declaraciones testimoniales o se presentara evidencia, por ejemplo, evidencia médica en los casos de torturas, el Ministerio de Defensa y sus abogados avanzaron en hacer acuerdos económicos con las familias que significaron en estos casos alguna compensación monetaria, pero que fueron hechos bajo, por un lado, un acuerdo de confidencialidad para que no se supiera públicamente que había existido este pago, y por el otro lado, bajo la aclaración de que esto no significaba de ninguna manera un reconocimiento por parte del Estado de que había habido una acción ilegal. De modo que tampoco estas esporádicas o hasta en algunos casos diría arbitrarias concesiones de reparación económica pueden ser tenidas en cuenta como tales si no son parte de un reconocimiento de responsabilidad. Es decir, que lo que prevalece en todos los casos es la falta de asunción de parte de los responsables de haber participado en esos crímenes, lo que deja a la familia siempre en un estado de indefensión.
Y como hemos hablado en la introducción, tuvimos la situación que había un sistema que estaba comenzando poco a poco a dar algunos resultados a familias y con la ley del 2023 se cerró todo. Cuéntame un poco de la situación actual en Argentina, en el sentido de que en los últimos años ya han tenido sus logros relativos de justicia transicional, pero en los últimos años hay bastante presión, ¿no? Para tratar de retroceder contra los logros de la transición con respecto a la impunidad, sectores volviendo a denegar que había violaciones, etcétera, etcétera. Cuéntanos un poco de la situación.
Sí, la situación en Argentina, nosotros hemos podido avanzar enormemente en la búsqueda de justicia. Empezamos en el año 83 con un juicio muy importante que fue el juicio a las juntas militares que condenó a 5 de los 9 mayores generales durante la dictadura. Después de eso, también esta se complementó con el informe de la CONADEP, que fue la Comisión de la Verdad, dos hitos muy importantes, juicio de las juntas y CONADEP, pero que fueron seguidos de un perdón presidencial que dictó el presidente Menem y unas leyes de impunidad que rigieron durante más de 15 años. Desde el año 2001 en adelante, luego de una crisis social, política y económica muy grande que atravesó mi país, la situación cambió y la sociedad argentina, en un reclamo muy fuerte de memoria, verdad y justicia, logró que se llevaran a juicio a los máximos responsables. Hoy tenemos 1.201 personas condenadas y cumpliendo condena. Se llevaron adelante más de 600 juicios en todo el país, tanto contra militares como contra miembros de fuerzas de seguridad, algunos civiles acusados que incluyen a curas católicos que apoyaron la represión, médicos, jueces, fiscales. Es decir, que nosotros consideramos que la justicia se ha cumplido, que logramos hacer justicia, que logramos verdad, que logramos justicias y tuvimos también un programa amplio de reparaciones económicas. Ahora bien, como vos decías, Daniel, en los últimos años, en los últimos 2 años en particular, hay una avanzada en contra de las políticas públicas que aún están siendo implementadas, las políticas de memoria, el resguardo de los sitios de memoria, la política de preservación de los archivos y también la investigación que todavía continuaba dentro de los archivos estatales como para poder aportar mayor información a los juicios que siguen en trámite. Desde el gobierno actual, desde el gobierno de Javier Milei y de todos los funcionarios del Estado, hay una intención muy clara con acciones concretas para desmantelar estas políticas públicas a través del despido de los funcionarios que estaban a cargo. Se ha despedido casi la totalidad de los trabajadores que llevaban adelante tareas en estas políticas públicas. Y esto se combina con un discurso negacionista e incluso pro dictatorial, o sea, que reivindica las violaciones a los derechos humanos, algo que en esta sociedad no pasaba, no había pasado desde terminada la dictadura militar. No es una situación aislada de Argentina, es una situación que se repite en la región de América Latina y creo que a nivel mundial también, y los retrocesos que ustedes han visto o el avance de la ley del legado, que por suerte pudo de alguna manera ser reformada y evitar la amnistía total, es parte, creo yo, de un proceso en contra de la agenda de derechos humanos y en general de negacionismo respecto de los derechos en estos planos, ¿no? A nivel internacional.
Thank you, Maria Jose. Well, that gives us a link to our next speaker, Maurice Politi, who we both met recently in Sao Paulo. Maurice, can you hear us okay?
Yes,
So,
sir. Yeah.
welcome, Maurice. So Maurice is a former political prisoner in Brazil. He's one of the founders of the Center for Preservation of Political Memory in Brazil and the organization's first director. He's an activist in the field of human rights and political memory, and works as a researcher, content advisor, and speaker. So, Maurice, you've heard Maria Jose's exhibition of the current Argentinian situation, and you're also familiar with the Northern Ireland situation. My first question to you is, what are the key barriers to confronting Brazil's legacy of impunity, and how have the more recent political dynamics influenced that?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to this seminar, to all the organizer. I would say that basically the long time which took to start discussing about the matter, it was basically what held up us in Brazil to discuss. And I would like to give you a short panorama, because not everybody is very familiar with the Brazilian situation. Brazilian had a dictatorship installed, the second one in Latin America after Paraguay, in 1964. This coup in 1964 led to almost 50,000 people being in prison, to 10,000, about 10,000 tortured in the whole country, and according to the National Truth Commission, about 486 killed and disappeared people. I would say that the first call that the civil society had for amnesty was in 1975, which means 11 years after the coup, and still within the military dictatorship, when the women's and the family of the detainees started protesting and asking for amnesty. This amnesty law came in 1979, which means 15 years after the coup. The amnesty law was promulgated by the government. They took a law to the parliament. The government, the last dictator, Figueiredo, he with himself, with his people who supported him, they win by 275 votes to 270. That would mean that 270 deputies were not in favor of the amnesty law. No, that means that they were not in favor of this amnesty law that the government had promulgated. And this amnesty law has, as I told you when you were here, has a very symbolic small text which leads to impunity for all this year, which they say in an article of the law, they say, are those who have acted politically between the years 1964 and now they have amnested, they have the amnesty, and there is a comma, and they say, and the connected crimes to them, and the military people and the right, all the people against the full amnesty, they took advantage of this small connection crime, and they say the crime they have committed in the cells, killing people, torturing people, they were connected to the crimes, to the supposed crime, the resistance people did against the government. This is the key of the impunity which lasts until today. In 2010, which means
just to get that right, Maurice, essentially there was an amnesty law that was supposedly to benefit those who should never have been in prison, and however it ended up also benefiting the military and others who had tortured those who were political prisoners.
Exactly. They benefit them by this small word called connected crime.
Connected crime. Yeah.
And all the lawyers, they will say a connected crime is a crime I commit if I steal your car, and with your car I go and make a hold up in a bank. When I'm caught, I have two crimes: the crimes of the car and the crimes but they are connected. Yeah. But it is no between the fact that I'm in a cell. In a prison, what is the connection between this and the torture and the violation I'm having? And so only after 31 years after this law, which means 31 years elapsed until, for the first time in 2010, the Lawyers Association requested from the Supreme Court the interpretation of this connected crime. And unfortunately for us, by 9 votes against 2, the Supreme Court agreed that this paragraph was protecting those who violated the crimes, that violated the human rights. That means that 31 years, it's a whole generation. As we always say, somebody who was born in 1964, it took him 31 years, he was already an adult, and he would never deal with this problem of the impunity. And this is basically the key which sustain the opinion of the military and the government until today, holding for a full transitional justice. In Brazil, the transitional justice. At the contrary, in Argentina, when immediately after after the military were set out, immediately the trial began. Here there was no trial. Nobody was trial. Nobody was on trial about these crimes. But the reparation, one of the legs of the transitional justice is economic reparation. Yet the economic reparation, yes, they took place in Brazil.
Okay, and then the other thing, again, a leg of transitional justice is the issue of memorialization, and memorialization initiatives can play a crucial role in sharing collective memory. And when we were in Sao Paulo recently, you showed us a number of the projects that you've led, which are successful and emerging projects in Brazil that are actively preserving the memory of state violence and resisting historical erasure, and are receiving hundreds, in fact, thousands of visitors that really keeps the past reality alive. Could you share with us some of the details of the memorialization initiatives you're involved in?
Yes, basically this started in around 2010. That means 15 years ago, when the call for preserving the places where tortures and prisons were effected in whole Brazil were to be kept, and sites of memory were to be built. So we started in São Paulo, as you have seen recently, in what we call the Resistance Memorial. Resistance Memorial is where the former place of the civilian political police was functioning, and where we were arrested for many months there until we went to the prisons, and a place of torture. And it took us about 4 to 5 years to convince the government that you can see. There is a picture. This is the building where today is the Resistance Memorial, a place where the cells, the former cells, are preserved, and where we receive about 80,000 visitors per year. It's the only place in Brazil which is already institutionalized. I mean, it's the government. It's funded by the government, and there is a big program of keeping the memories of the people who were in prison there. There are a lot of programs, educational programs. Then there is a second place we are trying to convert also into a place of memory in São Paulo, which is called, if you have the next slide, this one, Memorial da Luta pela Justiça, Memorial for Fighting of Justice. In this big house where the judge, because at the contrary of what happened in Argentina, then here in Brazil, 80%, 90% of the whole prisoners, all the people who were in prison, were judged and sentenced to court. So in this case was the military court where we faced the trial. I was judged in this place. This place is now being refurbished to be converted in a museum, which will be called Memorial for Fighting of Justice, and where we intend to have there a place to show the young generation how it is when you have a time where no justice is available, where you can find justice. Because in this place is where prisoners and lawyers were telling, it's the only place where they were telling the truth about the tortures and what happened in the jail. So this is the second place we are working, and we believe that in São Paulo, in another 2 years, it will be opened. And the third place is the former DOI-CODE, where you also have been. And if you can show the next slide, you will see this is the place where María José, Daniel, and Paul have been there. Is a place where a clandestine center for torture and interrogation. It was the first place where we were taken when we were in jail. Today is an empty, it belongs to the state government, not to the federal government. That's why we are having a lot of problem to convert in a memorial, because the governor, which is a denialist of all this, the period of the dictatorship. But it was decided that we would take at least 150 people every month to visit the place. We have regular visits to the place, which remains the same as it was 60 years ago when I went there, this place to be interrogated and tortured. I mean, this is called the Information Operation Detachment, and it has been visited by a group of young people, of students, and also professionals, people who are interested to know the past. And we are trying to convert this in a third memorial in São Paulo.
Yeah, it prevents the denial of yeah. Thank you, Maurice. What we'll do now is we'll move to our final speaker, but just to remind everyone to begin to think within the audience of potential questions as we move into the question and answer session after the final speaker. The question should be posted in the chat facility. Our final speaker, who will speak for the situation in Lebanon, is Brigitte. She's an attorney in law, human rights expert, and the executive director and founder of the organization Justice Without Frontiers in Lebanon, which works on advancing justice, democracy, and human rights through legal reform, strategic litigation, and community empowerment. So welcome, Bridget. So the first question I have for you really is Lebanon's post-Civil War context has lacked a comprehensive transitional justice framework. What have been the main obstacles to advancing truth-seeking and accountability in the context of Lebanon?
Hello, I will be speaking in Arabic. Okay. فيما يتعلق بلبنان، لبنان عاش حرب أهلية لفترة كتير طويلة، من فترة من 70 لحوالي التسعينات، ولكن واجهت العدالة بلبنان عدة عقبات. هالعقبات هي عقبات سياسية، قانونية، اجتماعية. أبرز العقبات أولا مرتبط بقانون العفو يلي صدر سنة 1991. هذا قانون العفو يلي رسخ ثقافة إنهاء ثقافة الإفلات من العقاب. فعدد كتير كبير من مجرمي الحرب لم يحاكموا، لم يحاسبوا، بل على العكس هن موجودين حاليا بسدة المحاسبة، بسدة المسؤولية، وبسدة أخذ القرار على صعيد الدولة. يعني بنشوفهم بالحكومة، بنشوفهم بالمجالس النيابية، وحتى هن عم بيكملوا عملهم من خلال عملهم الحزبي. هيدا واحد. 2، لبنان هو دولة طائفية، بمعنى أنه نحن بلبنان عنا حوالي 19 قانون للأحوال الشخصية، واللي بيحكم لبنان هي الطوائف. يعني حتى وإن كان القانون بلبنان هو قانون مدني، ولكن يلي بيحكم لبنان فيما يتعلق بتوزيع الوظائف العامة، حتى العمل على صعيد يعني رئيس الوزارة بيكون من الطائفة السنية، رئيس مجلس النواب من طائفة معينة، رئيس الجمهورية، فكل الوظائف توزع على أساس طائفة. والتوزيع الطائفي عزز الحماية المتبادلة بين الطوائف. يعني بطلت طائفة تهجم على طائفة، كل طائفة تقدر تحمي زعماء الخاصين. هيدا من جهة. ومن جهة تانية الطوائف، وإن كنا نحكي على طوائف، ولكن هذه الطوائف كان لها تأثير كتير كبير على الصعيد السياسي، وعلى صعيد القرارات في لبنان، وعلى صعيد مكافحة الفساد، وعلى صعيد حتى وصول المرأة لسدة القرار. العقبة الأساسية الأخرى عن هي المرتبطة بضعف استقلالية القضاء. نحن حتى بالقضاء اللبناني عنا وهذا يمكن شأن عدد كتير كبير من السلطات القضائية بالعالم، ولكن عنا تدخلات سياسية، لأنه حتى التعيينات بمحل من المحلات مربوطة بالانتماء الطائفي. ففي عنا ضعف باستقلالية السلطة القضائية، ولكن نتيجة الجهود الكثيفة تم العمل على إقرار، يعني بالمجلس النيابي وضعت أول مسودة لاستقلالية القضاء على أمل أنه هذا القانون يقر كما هو، وأن لا يكون في تعديل للقانون لضمان إنهاء الإفلات من العقاب. نقطة أساسية كمان كتير مهمة لازم نحكي عنها، هي أنه بلبنان من سنة 2019 قطع بمرحلة مراحل كتير صعبة. أولا الثورة، ثانيا انفجار مرفأ بيروت، ثالثا الأزمة الاقتصادية والاجتماعية يلي أثرت بصورة أساسية على السلطة القضائية، على القضاء، على الوصول للعدالة. فنتيجة الأزمة الاقتصادية نسبة الفقر زادت في لبنان، ولما زادت نسبة الفقر نسبة الاستغلال أكيد زادت، ولكن اهتمامات الأشخاص الأفراد بطلت مرتبطة بالعدالة، صارت مرتبطة بكيفية تأمين الاحتياجات الخاصة لهم من أكل وشرب وطبابة وغيرها. فبطل المطلب الأساسي هو العدالة، هيدا من جهة. ومن جهة تانية بفترة من الفترات تم القضاء كان بحالة إضراب، يعني أضرب، بطل يشتغل نتيجة الأزمة الاقتصادية الموجودة، ونتيجة صعوبة الوصول. صار في عنا خلينا نقول عدد كتير كبير من القضاة اللي تركوا راح. ولكن أيضا خلينا نحكي على الشيء الإيجابي، أنه بالوقت الحالي بميزانية الدولة حاليا اليوم بالذات تم إقرار بضمان يعني تم إقرار قانون بمساعدات أو بزيادة رواتب القضاة لضمان استمراريتهم بالعمل. هيدا الشيء أيضا كمان مربوط بنقطة أخرى يلي هي مرتبطة بدور المجتمع. يعني نحن نتكلم عن القوانين، نتكلم عن السياسات، ولكن من المهم جدا أن نتكلم عن دور المجتمع. المجتمع هو أيضا مجتمع صامت، ما بيطالب، يعني لا يطالب لا يواجه الماضي، يعني في تردد في مواجهة الماضي، يمكن نتيجة تكرر الأزمات أو نتيجة الجهل بالماضي. ولكن كمان لابد من الإشارة إلى أن الفساد أيضا يلعب دور كتير مهم بالوصول للعدالة وبتحقيق العدالة، سواء كانت عدالة عم نحكي على موضوع إنهاء الإفلات من العقاب، على موضوع المحاسبة، على موضوع العدالة الانتقالية وغيرها. ولكن يعني أنا اللي بدي أقوله كمان أكثر أنه بالوقت الحالي كثير عم يكون في شغل على موضوع القوانين، على موضوع تعديلها، على موضوع التوعية القانونية، الناس تقدر تعرف بحقوقها وكيفية الوصول للعدالة وضمان الوصول لها وتحقيق الوصول لها ضمن هيدا الإطار. إذا ما بعرف إذا بتحب كون عم بحكي
I
على
wanted you to, yeah, to pick up on that. I mean, you've painted a picture there of a very difficult context for transitional justice. You've created a picture of there not being an official process, the economic crisis being very dominant, and the judicial context as well. So, in all of that context, what has been done how has civil society, victims' families, grassroots movements within the Lebanese context tried to claim justice or preserve memory in all of that context?
شكرا لسؤالك. المجتمع المدني لعب دور كتير مهم خلال كل هالأزمات، حتى بمعظم الأزمات المجتمع المدني لعب دور الدولة ببعض الأحيان. خلينا أعطيك بعض الأمثلة. لما بنحكي على المخفيين قسرا، المخطوفين والمختفيين قسرا، في لجنة في لبنان، ويمكن هذا أكثر مثل نحن بنربطه بموضوع العدالة الانتقالية. أنشئت لجنة لأهالي المخطوفين والمفقودين قسرا في لبنان، يلي عملت على توثيق حالات الانتهاكات وعملت على كشف الحقائق. بسنة 2018 صدر أول قانون يتعلق بموضوع المخفيين والمفقودين قسرا، ولكن للأسف أنه ما في توعية كافية، يعني مش كل حتى الحقوقيين هن غير ملمين بهذا القانون. كما أنشئت الهيئة الوطنية الهيئة الوطنية للمخفيين قسرا، ولكن حتى الهيئة الوطنية هي تعاني من أزمات، من تحديات عديدة للقيام بعملها، منها تأمين الميزانيات اللازمة ووضع الأنظمة الخاصة لها، ولكن هي تحاول جاهدة للعمل على هذا الموضوع. شو نعمل أشياء إضافية؟ الأشياء الإضافية أنه نحن بسنة 2025 هي الذكرى الخمسين للحرب الأهلية في لبنان، وعادة في العديد من النشاطات تقام كل سنة، وهي النشاطات العنوان الأساسي تبعولها كي لا ننسى وحتى على طول نتذكر. وهي هالنشاطات عادة بتكون مرتبطة بالمؤتمرات، بالنشاطات الإعلامية. حاليا في مسرحية تجسد مفهوم الاختفاء القسري وحالات الاختفاء القسري، وأيضا اللقاءات يلي بتصير. ولكن أهم نقطة صارت أيضا بهذا الموضوع، ويمكن هذا شغل صار جديد، هو توثيق الانتهاكات، وأيضا مع التركيز على دور المرأة فيما يتعلق بتوثيق الانتهاكات. يعني بالحرب الأهلية بلبنان نتحدث عن حرب أهلية ذهب ضحيتها المئات أو الآلاف وغيرهم، ولكن من الشغل يلي نعمل بلبنان Dealing with the Past اسم البروجرام، إنه قديش هن عدد النساء يلي كانوا محاربات، قديش عدد النساء اللواتي قتلنا أو اغتصبنا، شو دور النساء بالعائلة نفسها، يعني العائلة يلي راح فيها خطف رب العائلة أو أي حدا، شو كان دور النساء. وهيدا كان شيء كتير مهم، ونحن عم نبني أكيد عليه، لأنه كمان هيدا بيقدر يخلينا نفهم، نقدر نتوسع بمفهوم العدالة، تقدر تكون شاملة لكل الفئات، ما نكون عم نحكي على أرقام، بس نحكي على وقائع. مثلا أنا بدي أعطيك مثل، أنه نحن بالحرب الأخيرة على لبنان نحكي على مثلا كذا ألف شهيد أو قتيل، بيناتهم مثلا 200 امرأة، ولكن نحن بحاجة نفوت بتفاصيل أكثر على نوع الجرائم التي طالت الفئات المهمشة، وهذا شيء كتير مهم. أيضا من الأمور المهمة يلي صارت بلبنان هو التركيز على موضوع العدالة والوصول إلى العدالة. يعني العدالة مش ضروري بتكون عم تبدأ بشيء كتير كبير، هو بتبدأ بالأمور الصغيرة جدا، لما أي فرد يقدر يعرف بحقوقه ويقدر إنه يبلغ عن أي انتهاك وصل لحقوقه، وهيدي مثل كرة ثلج بتكبر. النقطة الثانية هو العمل مع الجهات الحكومية، لا سيما وزارة العدل، وكثير نشاطات، خاصة أنا إذا بدي أحكي عن عدل بلا حدود قمنا بها مع وزارة العدل فيما يتعلق بضمان الوصول للعدالة رغم التحديات الموجودة، وحتى ووضع الآليات للوصول للعدالة، لا سيما خلال الأزمات. خلال الأزمات مثلا بفترة كورونا تم الاعتماد. يمكن فترة كورونا هي تجربة صغيرة، بس أنا بحب شير لها لأنه كانت تجربة ناجحة ولازم نكون عم نبني عليها. أنه تم إصدار قرارات حماية عن طريق الأونلاين، تم استخدام منصة الأونلاين، وهذه كانت للمرة الأولى في لبنان ولمرة واحدة. وأيضا من الأمور الأساسية كمان يلي نعمل عليها هو القوانين المتعلقة بمكافحة الفساد في لبنان. عندنا مجموعة كتير كبيرة بالقوانين، ولكن برجع بقول الوصول للمعلومة، مفهوم القانون، التوعية على القانون، هذا الشيء بعده مش منه كتير موجود، لهيك نحن كتير بنشتغل على التوعية بالقوانين. وأيضا خلال الحرب كانت قد صدرت عن الحكومة اللبنانية، وأنا بتصور هيدي نقطة كتير أساس للبنان، ولكن رغم أنه تراجع عنا، ولكن هو أعلن بأيار إعلان اختصاص المحكمة الجنائية الدولية للنظر بحالة جرائم الحرب التي ارتكبت على الأراضي اللبنانية من تشرين الأول 23 لا تاريخ صدور القرار، ولكن الدولة اللبنانية رجعت عنه. حتى وإن الدولة اللبنانية رجعت عنه، ولكن أنشئت خلية قانونية من الأشخاص الحقوقيين يلي درسوا شو الإمكانيات القانونية أمام الدولة اللبنانية يلي ممكن تتخذها لإنهاء الإفلات من العقاب أو للمحاسبة والمعاقبة. فأنا برأيي الشخصي أنا بشوف العدالة الانتقالية هي أمر كتير مهم، ولكن الأهم هو المحاسبة وإنهاء الإفلات من العقاب. يعني يكون عندنا أنظمة قانونية تعاقب على أشد الجرائم، على أشد الجرائم الخطورة، تعاقب بصرف النظر عن الحسنات الموجودة. هذه نقطة كتير مهمة، لأنه وإن تحدثنا على موضوع عدالة انتقالية وما حاسبنا، يعني ما صار في محاسبة حقيقية، ما اشتغلنا على القوانين، ففي يعني هي في شعرة معاوية بين العدالة الكاملة والعدالة الانتقالية. هيدا بصورة عامة اللي بقدر أنا أحكي عنه عن لبنان.
Thank you. Thank you. And I mean, there's a lot resonated there that brings us back to the impunity panel report as well, not just the gender focus, but also this issue of the importance of documenting violations. Many people in the Irish context documented violations in the 1970s, and those documents, there was no process to use them in until actually now, until the sort of present day. It took a long, long time, but it's only because of the documentation that that's been possible. Thank you to the four speakers for those initial inputs. We'll now move into the question and answer session. The first question has been posted into the chat. It's a question from Saneh, who works on impunity and enforced disappearances in Iraq, and was particularly struck by Mauricio's presentation. So the question to Mauricio first, and then to other panel members, is if you have any advice for civil society actors working in a political and social climate that is rife with denialism and blame for all sides, where things like memorialization are incredibly sensitive and necessary, both for the families of victims, but also to lay a more constructive foundation for society. And in the Iraqi context, that's nearly impossible due to threats from militias and other political factions. So how can you navigate such an environment in the speaker's opinion? Maurice, I'll go to you first. You're muted, Maurice.
Sorry, I was muted, yes. Thank you, Sana. And really, I believe this question is crucial. And it's a very difficult question to answer because each country has particulars to be defined and to be seen. And of course, I can only give you an example of what happened here in Brazil during the recent years when we had. You probably know that in 2016 we had a legitimate president, a woman called Dilma Rousseff, who was formerly a political prisoner, tortured lady, and she rose to the presidency of the country, which gives us a lot of hope. And it was under her that the National Truth Commission was installed 33 years after the amnesty law. As I said before, it's a whole generation, 33 years. So when she was impeached by the parliament, because one of the reasons was exactly because she had pointed her fingers against the military who were responsible for torture and for disappearance. This was one of the reasons why she got impeached. And after her, we had 4 years of full denialism and negationism of Jair Bolsonaro. During the years of Bolsonaro, really, it was a situation like we have today in Argentina. María José gave us the picture where really this subject of memorialization, transitional justice were simply denied. I remind you that President Bolsonaro received in his office the only man who was taken to civil court in Brazil, not criminal court, to civilian process, and defined him as a torturer. And this guy was the commander in one of the sites I showed in the picture. was received in the president's office as a national hero. So you can imagine that this was a really difficult time for us. But the only advice, it was also because of the fact that we had a president which was totally denying and making our claims in favor of the dictatorship, that also we had more people in the schools, professors, teachers who perceived that the only way that they could show the truth to their students was to take them to this memorial, resistance memorial, and show them what really happened against what the government was giving. This gives a very strong pad in the back, and we continued in a lot of organization from civil society making the effort of taking people to visit this place and telling them the truth. It's the only advice we can give you. I know Iraq situation is quite difficult, and about what you said, and it's difficult for us, the other half of the world, to talk about situation we don't know. But this was the way we took in Brazil to deny the denialism of the government.
So the use of those memorial sites. Maria Jose, you've been quite heavily involved as well in memorialization initiatives in Argentina, the Naval Museum that was the former torture center, but you're also now in a Bolsonaro type context in Argentina, as you have said. So have you any advice to the Iraqis or reflections on the memorialization situation in Argentina now?
Sí, en principio yo creo que nosotros trabajamos convencidos de que la memorialización es muy importante, sobre todo, sorry, especialmente para I can't take off the interpretation.
Ahora creo que lo he logrado apagar. Creo que
Sí, ok.
ahora.
Sobre todo decía, es importante para trabajar con las nuevas generaciones. Coincido con Maurice de que es muy difícil transmitir a la... I'm sorry, I can't do it. Wait a minute, please. Let's try now. Transmitir a las nuevas generaciones lo que ocurrió hace ya tantos años. En Argentina ya han pasado 40 años desde los hechos que queremos memorializar. Los sitios de memoria son un factor fundamental para los chicos de las escuelas, para estudiantes, para la sociedad en general, para poder transmitir lo que pasó. Ahora bien, en los casos en los que no hay una iniciativa estatal para llevar adelante estos procesos de memorialización, también creo que la sociedad civil tiene mucho para hacer. Hay experiencias muy interesantes, tanto en el caso de Brasil como en el caso, por ejemplo, de Chile o en Argentina, donde los procesos de memoria y las instituciones de memoria son instituciones de la sociedad civil. El caso del Museo de Derry, por ejemplo, también sobre lo ocurrido en Irlanda del Norte, que es un museo fantástico para poder acceder a lo que ocurrió, son iniciativas no estatales, hechos con esfuerzos privados o de organizaciones no gubernamentales y creo que son fundamentales. Pero nuestra experiencia en América Latina también indica que es muy importante contar con leyes de memoria, porque son muy difíciles de sostener estos proyectos en el tiempo. Los cambios de gobierno los afectan de manera muy sensible. Nosotros lo estamos viviendo ahora en Argentina, si bien nosotros estos proyectos son todos hechos con decisiones gubernamentales e incluso uno de ellos tiene una declaración de UNESCO sobre patrimonio de la humanidad. Pensamos que con eso iba a ser suficiente como para blindarlos frente a un contexto adverso y sin embargo hoy vemos que aún con esos resguardos es difícil defenderlos. Entonces me parece que tenemos que pensar como sociedades, como organizaciones de derechos humanos, en todos los mecanismos posibles para preservarlos, no solamente para llevar adelante estos proyectos de memoria, sino después también cómo sostenerlos y cómo preservarlos frente a entornos negacionistas o gobiernos que están en contra de estas iniciativas.
Hey, thank you, Brigitte. The same question really to you. There's a second question also in the chat now from Chris here in Redress, who says it's easy to get a bit despondent given the scale of challenges and increased power of the global anti-rights movement. Can you identify one or two signs of hope for accountability and justice? What keeps you energized? So if you want to respond to either or both of those questions. You're muted.
اوكي ثانك يو. رح اكون عم بجاوب هيك بصوره موجزه. اول شيء بتصور بالنسبة للإبقاء على الذكرى بذهون الشباب كتير مهم نحن نكون هيدي الأمور كلها مثل ما ذكرت موثقة. ورح أرجع أحكي عن لبنان، إنه نحن بلبنان كتاب التاريخ وقف عند انتهاء الحرب العالمية الثانية. بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية نحن بكتب التاريخ ما عم ندرس تاريخ لبنان الجديد، لا عن الحرب الأهلية ولا غيرها. لهيك نحن في كتب سرديات كتب توثيقات وضعت لكل الأعمار، لكل الناس يقدروا يعرفوا شو صار بهالحروب، وينعمل نقاشات كثيرة. ولكن أنا كبريجيت وأنا كشخص بشتغل على موضوع العدالة من أكثر من 15، أكثر كمان من 15 سنة. أنا أؤمن أنه ما في سلام وما في أمان بالعالم إلا من خلال العدالة. تكون صريحة معكم، بفترة من الفترات نتيجة الحروب يلي صارت بالمنطقة، لا سيما الحرب اللي بعدها مستمرة بغزة، الحرب اللي صارت بلبنان وغير غير من الدول، وهالدبل ستاندرد يلي صار بمفهوم العدالة ومفهوم حقوق الإنسان، لا شك أنه صار في عنا هذا الإحباط أنه نحن نناضل لقضايا حقوق الإنسان، ولكن بنفس الوقت هذه المنظومة لا تطبق، ما في مين يحميها. ولكن الإيمان، يعني هي شغلة من جوا الإيمان، إنه ما في يغير شيء بالعالم إلا إذا اشتغلت على موضوع العدالة. والعدالة وقتها طويل، يعني العدالة لا تتحقق بسرعة. يعني ممكن إنه أعمل مشروع معين أقدر أحصد فيه نتائج سريعة، ولكن أقدر أشتغل على موضوع العدالة وأعمل تحقيق تغيير استراتيجي، غير القوانين، استحصل على أحكام، هذا بده وقت طويل. أنا امرأة من دولة خلقت بالحرب، ربيت بالحرب، عم بربي أولادي بالحرب، عايشة بمنطقة فيها حرب. أنا برفض أطلع من المنطقة، لأني أؤمن أنه أنا إذا ما قدرنا نشتغل على هيدا الموضوع، موضوع العدالة والوصول إلى العدالة، نحن ما بنقدر، برجع بقول، نحقق لا سلام ولا أمن. هيدا من جهة. من جهة تانية، نحن كأشخاص حقوقيين، شو هو الدافع؟ نحن كأشخاص حقوقيين نشتغل على القوانين وعلى قضايا الحقوق الإنسان. نحن إذا بنطلع حوالينا، الناس اللي حوالينا في ألم كتير كبير، وجع أشخاص تعاني من ظلم، تعاني من انتهاك، تعاني من حالات اغتصاب، هي ضحايا حرب، هي ضحايا جرائم صغيرة. ولكن هذه الأشخاص تجهل حقوقها وما عندها القدرة المادية أو القدرات أن توصل تقدر تطالب بحقوقها. والضحايا سواء كانوا ضحايا جرائم عادية أو ضحايا حروب، هن منهم بحاجة فقط لمساعدات إنسانية. يعني مخطئ من يظن أنه هذه الضحية هي بحاجة بس لمساعدة إنسانية، لأكل وشرب ودواء وسقف وخيمة. لا، هالأشخاص تيكونوا عايشين براحة دائمة هن بحاجة لموضوع لتحقيق العدالة. لهيك أنا بشوف أنه هذا اللقاء هالويبينار يلي انعمل اليوم هو كتير مهم، ويا ريت هيدا الشيء بيتكرر، نقدر نوصل فيه، نوصل هالثقافة وهالتجارب لعدد كتير كبير من الأشخاص، ونقدر نجيب هالشباب وهالصبايا وهالجيل الجديد، نقدر نعلمهم الثقافة مش القراءة، هي ثقافة العدالة، ثقافة حقوق الإنسان، ونقدر نطبق عليها ونوضع آليات لتطبيقها، ونقدر نعلم العالم إنه العدالة بدها وقت طويل. في أحكام مذكرات توقيف صدرت عن المحكمة الجنائية الدولية ما كان حدا بيتوقع إنها تصدر، ولكن صدرت، وهيدا أول خطوة للتغيير حتى وإن لم تنفذ بعد، ولكن هيدا أول خطوة للتغيير. فأنا من هون يعني هيدا الدافع الأساسي يلي أنا بشتغل يلي بيدفعني أناضل وأكفي، وبنفس الحماس وهذا الشيء مبني على وجع ناس أنا بشوفهم، مبني على حاجة، ومبني على ضرورة تأمين مستقبل آمن. وشكرا.
Thank you, Brian. Turning back to you, the same question really. Can you identify one or two signs of hope for accountability and justice? And I know you've been involved in this impunity panel in the Northern Ireland context. You're also very heavily involved in the Ukrainian situation and process. You'll be back there shortly. So what are your reflections on both of those situations? And can you give us any signs of hope for accountability and justice?
I think that where there are successes, it really gives hope and energy to others. So there were partial successes in the Northern Ireland context, right? One of the mechanisms which was working a bit was coroner's inquests. So a family could bring a case to a coroner's court. If it was accepted, the coroner would be able to hold a judicial proceedings, it could subpoena witnesses, cross-examine them, and then come to a verdict about whether or not whoever had been killed, often by British security forces, had been killed lawfully or not, or justified or not. I mean, they couldn't prosecute the individual perpetrator.
No criminal or civil liability, but fact-finding.
But fact-finding.
Yeah.
And this, I don't want to say that this proved satisfying for people, but it was a lot better than nothing. And the point I'm trying to make is it wasn't just for the family who got that verdict. Other families then took hope and more energy from it. But I think the lesson really is, some of these things do take a very long time. I mean, there was a mass killing by British soldiers in West Belfast in Ballymurphy in 1971, and the coroner's inquest only concluded there 3 years ago. The Bloody Sunday killings of 1972, when 13 unarmed protesters were killed by British soldiers. One British soldier is going to be put on trial in September of this year. It is more than 50 years later. So I think one of the things that we ought to be reminding people in any country is that this does take a long time, but it's not necessarily hopeless. If I can talk just for a second about Ukraine, Ukraine isn't in the past. I mean, there are war crimes being committed in Ukraine every day. And just in the last 3 years, there have been thousands and thousands of war crimes. The prosecutor's office in Ukraine has registered 150,000 war crimes. And it's sort of overwhelming numbers. They've managed to process some of those cases. They've managed to get 100 plus convictions of Russian soldiers, but that's less than one conviction for every 1,000 war crimes. Eventually, there may have to be some other mechanism to look at the picture as a whole. But the other thing, and I think a couple of the previous speakers also said this, I don't think this is a choice about, should we bother carrying on with this, right? Particularly for survivors and the families of bereaved. I mean, they can't just give up and walk away, right? Other people, practitioners, people who work at NGOs might think, oh, I've done 20 years, I've had enough. For other people, they don't have that choice. And so I've been doing this sort of work for a long time, and I've decided, it's okay to feel anything, including negative things. It's all right to be angry, it's all right to be frustrated, but don't despair. Like, you can't just give up and say none of this is ever going to work, because it's not fair to those people who are depending on the likes of us to support them and help push their cases.
Yeah, I mean, even with the Legacy Act that shut down everything, that shut down the investigations in the Northern Ireland context, it's made it very, very obvious that it's been shut down for a reason, that it's
Right.
been shut, the narrative has changed. It's very obvious that there is now a cover-up of violations rather than the official truth. So what looks like something that's a giant step backwards, and indeed it is nevertheless something that is highlighting what has actually happened rather than the denial of it.
And none of the families we spoke to affected in Northern Ireland said, "Oh, well, the Legacy Act is here, so we're going to give up." Nobody said that. The response was, "How else do we figure this out? How else do we get truth and accountability?"
That's right. And we are out of time. I'm going to hand back to Miriam in a second, but just, I suppose we've all been talking about breaking these cycles of impunity and the importance of it. And one final reflection, one of the more recent civil court cases in Northern Ireland before the Legacy Act closed them down was actually one that made a finding of a form of torture being used in the early 1970s in Belfast. And it's the form of torture which is now known as waterboarding, which is the sort of simulated drowning. We know that the forms of torture in the early 1970s in Northern Ireland were exported to Brazil. And we also know much more recently that they appeared at the hands of British and Americans in Iraq. And had there been accountability a lot earlier for those forms of torture and proper condemnation and accountability for those responsible, that maybe would have made it untenable. So the importance of these processes can't be underestimated. We are out of time. I want to thank our 4 amazing speakers, and I want to hand back to Miriam to close the event.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, for moderating so well this webinar, and warm thanks for the speakers for sharing your experience, your insights, but also your passion for accountability. And I think we need this very much in these difficult times. And I hope to see the audience again in the next edition of this webinar series. Until then, I wish you all a wonderful summer and take care. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias.